There we go. There goes the division bell, and we're live in the Politico Pub again. I'm joined by Ben Houchen, the Tories' own King of the North, who's elected Tees Valley Mayor in 2017, became a life peer in Boris Johnson's resignation honours in 2023, and he's probably the most senior Tory in power at this conference. So it's great to have you here, Ben. You're drinking a Guinness.
We're in a pub.
We're in a pub. Congratulations.
It's
10 o'clock in the morning and the bar's already open. So that's great. What's the best Guinness you've ever had?
I like Guinness Zero more than I like Guinness, actually. I think it doesn't have that kind of slightly metallic-y taste at the end. But people tell me that's because you've not had a real Guinness. Apparently real Guinness also doesn't have that at the end. But yeah.
Great. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Guinness Zero as well. So So I mentioned King of the North. We saw Andy Burnham last week being Keir Starmer's critical friend. Is that a role that you think a regional mayor should be playing? Is it important to sort of speak truth to the leadership?
I think the role of a regional mayor is to speak truth to anybody in relation to what you think is the most important thing for your area. And I did that on a number of occasions when the Conservatives were in power. Interestingly enough, I've probably done it less so with Labour being in power. I approach it in a slightly different way in trying to kind of build relationships where there's naturally a distance being in different parties. But I think the way that Andy Burnham has approached the role of mayor, in inserting himself into national politics, is not really what the regional mayoral role is about. But I think he chooses to do it as a platform for his kind of shot at Westminster at some point in the future.
Do you get on with Andy Burnham?
I get on well with Andy. On a personal level, I get on really well with Andy and Steve Rotherham as well, who, I couldn't even be further away from political alignment with someone like Steve Rotherham, but they're both really good people, and I get on with them on a personal level, and we do some minor bits and pieces together as mayors, but like I say, I tend to approach the mayoralty more in a parochial sense, and Andy approaches it in a different way, and that's fine. That's how he chooses to do it, but I think, as we saw over the last week or two, he's probably just got a little bit too big for his boots.
Enough of Labour. Let's talk about the Tory conference, which is where we are. Kemi Badenoch. Let's start with marks out of 10 for Kemi's first year or so in charge.
Yeah, I think it's been slow, and I think I'm on various public records as saying it's been a slow start, and I would have liked Kemi to have come out the blocks much quicker. And I get there's this reflective piece that we need to do, and we have to develop policy in detail, and she's very keen on. It's not just jumping to the answer, even if she might know it. It's having the evidence behind it so that when she's challenged or when people want to get into the detail, there's a level of credibility there. And it's this kind of reneging against kind of quick headlines and quick announcements that might, in principle, sound good to the public, but actually are they operationally efficient and do they work in practice? Now, I get that, but given where we are in politics today, and in particularly with the emergence of reform post-election, not just pre-election, but their increasing kind of wave of optimism and the work that they're doing, which is slightly sidelining the Conservatives. I don't think we don't have the room, and we don't have the luxury of being able to take that time. So I've been quite critical of Kemi. I think did a couple of interviews with Kemi yesterday on various different media outlets. It was the punchiest I've seen her be, actually, over the first 12 months. I thought she was quite fiery. I think she was quite determined. We've obviously seen some policy announcements, whether that's around net zero, indefinite leave to remain, illegal immigration, etc. I think, as I said yesterday on one of the media outlets, let's have more of it. The fact that it's taken so long has been frustrating, and you could make an argument that has created a vacuum in which reform have been successful in filling, which has made our job harder. But hopefully Kemi can recover that, and hopefully this conference is the start of that reset, and us being more forward-thinking, connecting with the public, getting out there, talking about policy and talking about the things that matter to people.
What happens if we don't see an improvement in May? It feels like this is kind of a moment where she's doing the things you say, being a bit more punchy. What happens if that doesn't translate into an improved performance in the polls and in the elections in May?
I don't think things are going to improve in May. There is still a huge struggle. There are lots of factors of which Kemi inherited post-election, the low point of the Conservatives, the hangover of a Labour campaign on 14 years of Tory failure, which I think is completely unfair, but in the election period we didn't do enough to combat it. She is trying to mend and pick up a lot of the pieces, And like I said, she could have gone a bit more quickly. But even if she starts now, which it sounds like she is, and she is being much more punchy, getting to May and assuming that we're going to hold as many councillors or increase our councillors in May, I think is going to be tough. The question is, I suppose, how do we continue to stop the ebb away from the Conservatives? And I suppose May is also quite interesting because the number of Conservative councillors, councillors that are up compared to, say, other councillors or Labour councillors, I think is about, somebody told me just the other day, 28, 29% of councillors up are Conservative, nearly 50%, 48, 49% are Labour. So there's also a different dynamic that it's not just about gross amount of councillors that you can keep or add to. It's also going to be interesting in how the Conservative position compares to, I think in particular, the Labour Party, who I think are going to have a much rougher ride than we are come the May elections. That's
really interesting. Mel Stride's in the hall at the moment, making the case for more Tory cuts. He's talking about the need to cut more government. Is that really the way to differentiate yourself from reform? You're meeting them on migration, but it seems to be like, we're going to meet you there, but our thing is that it's going to be more austerity.
I think you have a budget that's coming in November that is going to see a minimum of £25 billion worth of tax rises. And that's a minimum. Like, the numbers could be worse, but I think everybody's pretty accepting that a minimum of 25 billion are coming down the track. The Labour Party have never, ever uttered the word spending cuts or austerity. And where some people, I think, behind the scenes have mentioned it, they have been quick to slap them down and stop them from doing so. So we're going to see huge tax rises. We see huge inefficiencies within various government budgets. We see the ballooning cost of quangos. We see the ballooning cost of the benefits bill. We see issues around illegal immigration and the net cost of the taxpayer. So absolutely, is government costing people too much and the taxpayers having to foot that bill far too much? Of course they are. But for me, often it's about how you communicate with that with the public. And I think we need to do a better job before we get into the specifics. Interestingly, it goes a bit back to the Kemi argument. Same with Mel a little bit. It's, having specific policies 3.5, 4 years out from a general election, in broad terms is a good idea, but not necessarily the detailed specifics. What we've got to do is be able to identify with people again and create that story of, what does the Conservative Party stand for now? Who are we for? Under Boris Johnson, there was a very strong lower middle class, working class group of people who hadn't voted at all before, never mind for the Conservative Party, who came out and voted for a Conservative Party that felt like it was for them. Are we still for that? Are we still for the Red Wall? Are we still for those people? The whole conversation, are we retreating back into the shires in the southeast? I think these are some serious questions that we as a Conservative Party need to answer first before we can start talking to the public. That question of, how do you define what a Conservative voter looks like? I think if you were to ask most Conservatives at the minute, you get a lot of different answers.
That's really interesting. You mentioned Boris Johnson there. Your opponents have kind of, really cottoned onto this attack on the Boris wave of immigration, those huge immigration numbers. Did Boris Johnson get that wrong? And is it something that you've talked to him about?
I think, well, yes, he did, and the Conservative Party as a whole got it wrong. I still am a big proponent of Brexit. I think it was the right thing to do. A sovereign nation should be able to make the laws and choose how to run the country on behalf of the people. It shouldn't be left for other supranational or other international bodies to dictate that. And I'm sure we could get into a very long and detailed discussion about international treaties, which obviously adds some nuance to that. But taking back control was the right thing to do. I think what a number of Conservatives didn't realise, and I think I'd probably put myself in that bracket, is that we didn't appreciate just how little expertise and experience still existed in the system, because so much of that had been outsourced to the European Union for so many years. And so having a much more liberal immigration policy, forget illegal immigration, but actual immigration, legal immigration policy, was not what people voted for. They voted to take back control, and part of that was to reduce the levels of immigration. And again, I go a step further and saying what that is meant by is, and it's one of the reasons people vote Conservative in 2019, it's the same reason that people vote for Brexit in 2017, is people are using it as a lightning rod to communicate their dissatisfaction on the unfairness that they see in the UK system. And they see those large levels of migrants coming into the country illegally. They see in places like mine, where there are significant areas of deprivation and poverty, they see unfairness in the system where migrants are being moved to Teesside because it's cheaper. They're jumping the queue because maybe London Borough councils are paying slightly more than the local council would. And we see families and friends and people in our community who've suffered for a long, long time And it's not that they're anti-migrant in the sense that there's racism there. They're anti-migrant in the sense that they see unfairness in the system. And it goes back to a very simple message you hear on the doorstep, which is we've got to look after our own before we can look after anybody else. That's not to say we shouldn't look after other people, but it's about prioritization. And again, the mass increase in migration that we saw, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years of the Conservative government, I think those chickens have come home to roost, which is again, fed into the reform bounce that we've seen.
That's interesting, and kind of on a related point, there's this kind of big pitch today about state support's only going to be for British citizens, and there's a kind of complicating factor with European citizens with settled status, which potentially we might have to see the EU withdrawal agreement reopened potentially. That's something that people are talking about. Is that something that you would support? Would you go as far as to have to kind of have a whole kind of new discussion with the EU in order to do this?
So I think, I've probably set my cards out on the table. So I think the principle of benefits and support being for British people, I think at a principle high level is a sound one. I think when you get into discussions around indefinite leave to remain and whether that applies going forward or retrospectively, of which it looks like there is an application retrospectively, is interesting because again it comes back to this point of fairness. Is there something wrong with I give a very personal example. My brother-in-law, my sister's husband, is from Spain. My sister lived in Spain for 4 or 5 years, studied there, ended up finding a husband and moved back to Teesside. He now has indefinite leave to remain. I've got 3 fantastic nephews, 10, 8, and 6, who are British citizens. How does that work in practice? Again, I think if you use those specific examples, people say, well, actually, is he contributing? Actually, yeah, he's got a well-paid job, he's paying the mortgage, he's paying his tax, he's contributing to society, he volunteers in the local school with Spanish lessons because, funding is tight and people don't. Yeah, all of these things. So you think, well, actually, if you spoke to pretty much anyone in this country, they'd say, well, yeah, that person's, why couldn't they stay here? Why can't they have indefinite leave to remain? They are integrating into society. Of course they do. And I think that's what often gets lost in this conversation. It's the broad headline is to capture. We were talking just offline just before this around how people disseminate and receive information from the media and where they get their media information. And I think naturally, if you get into a more nuanced conversation with people, it is more nuanced than that. So I think it's not as straightforward as saying we need to ban indefinite leave to remain. I think that would be wrong. There is nuance to all these conversations. Life is lived in the grey rather than the black and white. But something does have to be done about it. And people are expecting, with a system that is broken, and I do believe the UK government as a whole, not talking about the Labour Party, albeit I think they're useless as well, but the Whitehall system is broken. The reason people in Teesside voted for Brexit, never mind Boris, is because they felt like the system didn't work for them. And I absolutely believe that the wave that Reform are currently riding is Brexit 2.0. It's an idea that the system's still broken. I don't care whether it breaks even more because it's never worked for me. So we might as well break that glass and give it a go because the system hasn't worked for me for the last 30 years, so why wouldn't I try something different? That's the state with which large parts of our country currently feel like they're in, that they have to do that because people aren't listening to them.
So moving, you're obviously, let's go to your role as Tees Valley Mayor. You're chair of the South Tees Development Corporation, and there's been quite a discussion about whether you become an artificial intelligence growth zone or a hydrogen power. I know that it's sort of in the government sausage machine at the moment, as it were.
Yeah.
And the application, for those who don't know the background, for a hydrogen power plant is with the government at the moment, but you're championing this AI growth zone. What's happening there? What's the latest?
So for a long time, obviously, the South Tees Development Corporation, the Teesworks site, the former Redcar Steelworks site on Teesside, has always been planned to be for new regeneration, new jobs, but particularly in what we always knew was going to be energy-intensive industries because of the infrastructure that we have there. And we've championed various renewables projects, various manufacturing projects, and we're not prescriptive necessarily about the project per se, but we're creating that environment for energy-intensive industries to come. And BP, a number of years ago, back in, I think, 2021, approached us and started talking to us about a large-scale blue hydrogen project. And for those people that don't know what that is, it's basically a project that produces quite dirty hydrogen from traditional chemical processes, but you capture the carbon that would normally be emitted and it gets stored through a carbon capture process. It was an interesting project in 2021. It has emerged and developed to a state where BP don't really know whether they want to do it or not. They've, in effect, half won a competition with government, but they haven't agreed the funding yet for a 1.2 gigawatt facility for hydrogen production. It's very clear that they don't want to deliver that 1.2 gigawatt project. It's very clear that they've gone back to the drawing board and they're redesigning the whole thing. So from a mayoral point of view, I have a project that looks very shaky, doesn't look like it's going to happen. And then in the interim, we've been working directly with the Prime Minister's office, DSIT, and the Office for Investment on delivering the UK government's ambitions for AI growth zones, but particularly AI sovereign capability within the UK, because Teesside is, frankly, the only place that can do it at the scale if we want to be internationally competitive. So again, apologies for boring on, but if you look at America, if you look at the Trump project, the Stargate project in Abilene, Texas, which is with OpenAI, which is the world's largest AI project, that is a 1.2 gigawatt project that will be delivered over the next kind of 4 or 5 years. Phase 1 comes on next year. Teesside alone will deliver 5 gigawatts worth of data centers, which is nearly, what's that? It's 4 times the size of what the largest project in the US could be. And so there is both land, there's the land that we have has this hydrogen project that we don't want to happen because it's not going to happen. And we have this project that the government supports and we support wanting to happen. But what's interesting is there's this planning process, a DCO. And for people that don't know, it's basically a government planning process that they go through. And I'm confident in saying that there are large parts of the government that would prefer the AI project to go ahead and do not want the BP DCO to be granted. It's currently sat on Ed Miliband's desk. And I am acutely aware that there is a large fight going on inside of government where Ed Miliband seems to have set himself up against not just the Prime Minister, but a number of Secretary of State. And that resulted in the decision being deferred because the Prime Minister and his team, for whatever reason, didn't feel like they could tell Ed Miliband as the Secretary of State what to do. And that also played out a little bit afterwards in the reshuffle where Ed Miliband refused to be shuffled out of DESNZ. And so there's clearly a power struggle going on there, which infuriates me that a Prime Minister, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to have a grip over some of his Secretaries of State on a project that he is getting personally updated on a weekly basis. So it's hugely frustrating for us. There's a decision due on the 30th of October. Hopefully it goes the right way and we can deliver something that's truly transformational for this country with a Labour government, which would be great, I think, for not just the people of Teesside, but for the whole of the UK to see.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to have to go to the floor of questions, if anyone's got one. Okay, Pat.
Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm from Politico. With this Trump-inspired announcement on deportations and slashing net zero and foreign aid, do you think there's a chance that one day this conference will be remembered as a kind of funeral for one nation centrist conservatism?
It's a really good question. I think the Conservative Party is currently going through a process back to what many people in this conference would say are more traditional small state conservative values, and there is a definite pushback from both shadow ministers and members against what they see as some of the previous failures of the Conservative government. And I talk about that, and I agree with some of it, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, I don't buy this 14 years of Conservative failure because we won 1, 2, 3, 4 elections, right? So it's clearly not true. I do think the idea of, and this is something that Kemi has really struggled with, and this goes back to the point that we talked about, which is the time she's taken to try and develop this policy, because, again, both are great people, but Kemi has to try and keep people like Andrew Mitchell and Mark Francois in the same Conservative Party. And that's, that has been difficult over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and that's led to some policies that I think we're seeing come home to roost, which has caused a problem for the UK as a whole, and we're having to apologise for, and rightly so. And I think the process that the Conservative Party is going through at the minute is there will, and I don't think it's this conference, but I think at some point in the not too distant future, the Conservative Party is going to have to decide whether it wants to be a more traditional Conservative Party, or does it want to be more of a one nation party that someone like Andrew Mitchell and others feel comfortable with. And I don't think the Conservative Party has made that decision yet, which goes back to, again, what we were talking about is who are we for, who are we there to represent, and what do we stand for? And I don't think we've answered that question yet.
And are you on the Andrew Mitchell or the Mark Francois wing?
This is a typical politician's answer here. I kind of feel like I flip between the two. I mean, naturally, I think most people who followed anything that I do would probably consider me to be a more Boris kind of large state conservative, which I would say misunderstands my politics. I am quite hardline on things like immigration in general, particularly illegal immigration. I would spend huge amounts more. I would cut various parts of public spending, but I would spend a lot more on our police forces. I would give police much stronger powers. I think there is a deterioration in our society both standards and the way in which people interact with each other. So surprisingly, below the surface, culturally, I'm quite to the right. Economically, I'm more centrist in that I do believe the state has a role to play to create an environment. Whether that gets too far into subsidies and direct control and nationalisations is one thing, or whether it is the free market laissez-faire argument that some Conservatives make. I'm definitely not there, and that's also largely because of circumstance. I'm not there because the world isn't a level playing field. If the world was a level playing field, I would be a free market Conservative. But while China, to some extent the Europeans and now the Americans, are gaming the international markets, we can't pretend to be the only ones playing by the rules while the rest of the world isn't. And so I see the world as it is rather than I wish it was. So I'm definitely somewhere in between, which is one of the reasons I get on well with everybody from Boris through to Mark Francois and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Tom Tugendhat, right? I mean, I feel like I've got good relationships with all of them.
That very nuanced answer suggests you're not going to be great at my very quick fire to finish.
Oh, I'm never good at quick fire answers.
Commons or Lords?
For what? Just in general.
Which is best?
Commons.
Coalition partner, Reform or Labour?
Reform.
Kemi or Boris?
Kemi.
Hydrogen plant or AI data
AI data centres.
Sue Gray or Morgan McSweeney?
Sue Gray. I had a really good relationship with Sue. And she did some great things when she was there. And I think the Labour Party and the Labour government are poorer for not having her there.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. Could have gone. I've got about 3 more pages of questions, but for another day, come back another time. Thank you so much for coming along, and to Ben Houchen for talking to us. We've got James Cleverly, who's coming up next at 10:30, so we'll have a short break, and see you all very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.